When is enough enough? Stick around as I reflect on that question, looking at verse 3 of the Tao Te Ching. Welcome back to Healing from Racism, Lessons from the Tao Te Ching, where I am using the passages of the Tao Te Ching to illuminate with great simplicity what racism is, where it begins, how we internalize it, and how we might be able to find our pathway towards real, durable healing. I'm Lisa Giagona, and this video series is an accompaniment to my book, Healing from Racism. If you are not already on the waiting list, go ahead and use the link in the description to join the waiting list and be among the first to know. Reflecting on verse 2, I landed on one point for what racism is. Racism is a tool used to possess and a tool to control. Now, that might seem obvious. However, because racism is so embedded and so entangled, we can often lose the thread in the details. For those who suffer from racialized encounters, racism creates such paralyzing and debilitating effects on the individual and collective psyche that it is important to break down the concept to simple elements, to find a healing pathway forward, and to glean how to respond effectively. In verse 3, the first line reads, "If you overesteem great men, people become powerless." Racism comes into existence when one group of people tells a story that positions them on a superior position relative to others. They come to believe themselves superior, better than. And in the process, their story devalues and considers those others less than. This is overesteeming of great men. It's interesting to look at the cause and effect relationship spelled out in this passage. Overesteem of great men causes people to become powerless. But what does it mean to overesteem? It is to overvalue, to overestimate, to oversell, and to overpraise. The overesteeming happens on an individual, collective, and institutional basis. And there are many examples of this. One example that comes to mind and that is still having a profound impact on our society, on American society today, is the overesteeming of shareholders that happened in the 70s and 80s. In the mid 1950s, it was common for corporate management and even academics to believe and agree that corporations have multiple stakeholders to consider in their decision making. But in the 1980s, a news story was told that said the sole purpose of a corporation is to shareholders benefit. This has revolutionized the relationship corporations have with workers, communities, government, and the environment. As wages have stagnated, as an example for workers, everyday persons, workers, have felt more and more that nothing can be done to get them out of the dire circumstances and predicament that they're in. Another recent example of overesteeming of great men came with the appointment of 28% of active federal judges by the former president. These judgeships have contributed to a growing sense of dread that nothing can be done to resist the things that are happening and that are going to come through the judicial system for a generation. And we also overesteem on an individual basis in our intimate and work relationships. This leads to unhealthy codependence, where one person is made to feel and is actually disempowered to do basic things for themselves and for others, and also even to fulfill the responsibilities of their quote unquote assigned duties and job. Often, this is packaged as benevolent protection. Overesteem arises in two ways. One way to overesteem is to overpraise. For example, we are the chosen people. It is ours that is the true faith. And even in the example that I shared where we're raising children, overpraising in the form of good girl and good boy can produce adults who are addicted to praise, who become crippled when they go into the world and do not receive that stimulation. Their motivation is crippled and they become even angry in some cases that they're not getting that constant feed of praise. The other way to overesteem, of course, is to diminish the other. Your culture is backwards. You have no culture. This land was not occupied. There was no one here. You are savage, barbaric, not worthy. And if I can do both overpraise and diminish, I can actually accelerate the distance between these two things, even though there may be little actual difference, certainly initially. And the longer the distance persists, the more it seems natural or the way things are. And the more active our imagination becomes to fill in that gap with fearful ideas about the other. If those who are diminished buy into the overesteeming of great men, for example, they feel small, powerless, stuck, defeated. To overesteem great men, therefore, is to instantaneously create deprivation, which mirrors the concept of being and non being creating each other that we saw in verse 2 of the Tao Te Ching. What was non being now becomes being. Overesteeming produces powerlessness. This line in verse 3 adds to my understanding of what racism is. Racism is a tool to extract power. When power is extracted from people, they come to seem and feel less full, less able than they really are. The power extracted then produces overconfidence on the other side. Those who are overesteemed turn a blind eye to those whose extracted power enables their ascent, and the overesteemed come to believe that it is only through my great efforts that I accomplish this great thing. The first stanza of verse 3 continues to say, if you overvalue possessions, people begin to steal. What is the mark of a great man in a capitalistic, paternalistic society? Possessions. If possessions are what make a great man great, then things become targeted for theft because they are a way to fill the void created when one's power is extracted and the distance sustained. It's interesting to think about stealing of possessions and what is included in this idea of possessions. During slavery, people, human beings, were counted among the possessions of great men. The more slaves, the more people one owned, the wealthier one was. With possessions overvalued, it was made criminal to run away. Reduced to a possession, running away, an action that sought to reclaim some of the power that was being systematically extracted from a person, was punishable because you were stealing possessions of a great man. In effect, you were stealing yourself. Now, this is an example where I see this idea of law and order falling apart and failing because clearly there are laws that impede on people's personhood and therefore cannot and must not be followed. As we speak, there are laws that infringe upon people's personhood that are being written today. The void created by overesteeming great men and overvaluing possessions is much deeper than the material. A spiritual hollowing accompanies the material deprivation. Racism causes you to lose touch with your spirit, the fire and wind within you, the force that connects you to all things. Instead, racism works by making you think in delusionary terms: superior, inferior, good, bad, beautiful, ugly, and by centering possessions. These become the aim of your ambition. You lose your way. Stealing in a world where possessions are overvalued is a logical answer to the deprivation one feels. Unfortunately, stealing doesn't fill this deeper void. Healing from racism requires ejecting the illusions and the delusions created by the overesteeming of some and the devaluing of others. By releasing the stacking of people and working to remember your own value and learning to regard the value within others, one begins the path to enduring healing from racism. In the middle of verse 3, it reads, "The master leads by toughening their resolve." To resolve is to decide firmly on a course of action. I think of the people who were sitting at the counters in the 50s and 60s as they suffered painful and demeaning physical and verbal attacks. They were resolved to sit and persist despite the discomfort. All power to resolve to do something comes from within. Then the action follows. I'd argue that when you resolve, you are making a commitment that arises from a spiritual clarity. Racism aims to cripple the spirit, the source of your ability to resolve. Spiritual confusion and uncertainty creates debilitation, even when one is physically able bodied. The people become powerless. Then verse 3 ends counseling to practice not doing. And we'll come across this idea of not doing a lot in the Tao Te Ching. And so I want to take a moment to share with you how I see it. Think of the way of water. On its way down towards the ocean, water is resolved to make it to its destination, the ocean. It flows. Along the way, water inevitably encounters obstacles and barriers. It hits rocks, it hits stumps, it even gets caught in a dam. It's going to run into major obstacles, but the aim of water isn't to push these things down or out of its way necessarily. For the most part, when water doesn't have much volume, the way it maneuvers is to flow over, around, through, and it slowly eats away at its obstacles. And we know that water can cause great damage even when it's a trickle. That's the way of water. Often it is not trying to knock things over because it doesn't have enough power. But in situations when water gathers enough volume, enough mass, enough momentum, enough energy, the seemingly impossible becomes possible. From generating electricity to power an entire state to displacing millions of people in a few short hours. So it is with people and social struggles. Many amendments in the US Constitution are the result of many years of slow, steady work that finally reached a tipping point where there was enough momentum and enough energy gathered to knock down what was and replace it with a new what is. Therefore, when the Tao Te Ching says, practice not doing, it is not a passive thing. Instead, it is a flow. To flow, you must first remember your resolve. What are you called to do on this earth? What are you here to do? Then, like water destined for the ocean, you flow through all circumstances. You flow with the environment and with the situations that arise on your path. Encountering barriers and obstacles, you assess, what are my options? How can I go over it? How can I go around it? How can I go under it? How can I go through it? Or must I bid my time, slowly dripping to create a cave? How do I get to my destination while maintaining my wholeness? And like water, power comes when you combine your efforts and add mass. To practice not doing and to respond to social obstacles is to gather ourselves and to strengthen our efforts individually and collectively. To remember that there is power in collective action that allows us to distribute our weight and take on bigger challenges. Like water, this organization doesn't need to be centralized or hierarchical. It simply needs directed mass and energy. One lesson from the Tao Te Ching for healing from racism, therefore, is to resolve enough is enough. Instead of feeling inadequate and inept, flow along the most sustainable path for each situation because you have resolved that you are enough. Rediscover your resolve. Establish boundaries where you are not allowing yourself to overesteem people who are just people, human beings who, like you, hurt and love and have this capacity to be jealous and envious and want to blame and complain and feel all sorts of things and do all sorts of things, good and bad, but simply human beings. Instead of overesteeming so called great men, shift your attention back to the core of who you are and the work that you are here to do. And so these are the thoughts and reflections that arise as I look at verse 3 of the Tao Te Ching. This is one of my favorite verses because it really starts talking specifically to some of the things that relate to how racism works in our relationships. So, what do you notice? What do you feel? What do you remember as you look at verse 3 of the Tao Te Ching? Just a quick reminder to join the waiting list for my book if you're not already on it, using the link in the description. And I invite you and thank you for sharing this video with somebody else. And with that, I will see you next time as I will share a reflection on verse 4 of the Tao Te Ching.